William K. Stewart, F.E. Patzak, Sherlock Holmes and the Japanese Envoy. The New Adventures, Episode 3, based on characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, spoken by Sam Kusi. Upon returning from our 4-day trip to Scotland in early September of 1883, I could have certainly done with a short respite. The glum mood that Holmes had recognized in me and told me about on our return train ride manifested itself as a perpetual internal struggle between anxiety and exuberance, causing me to feel irritable and weary, which I attempted to mask with cheerfulness. I have only been able to get a little sleep since the life-threatening events that unfolded at Highgate Cemetery a few months earlier, for I have not yet been able to process them. This inability has furthermore impeded my efforts to put to paper the events of that particular case. I had planned to force myself to write them down in the coming days, for soberly recounting the facts would certainly facilitate my accepting the events, both emotionally and intellectually. But as fate would have it, our next case was already waiting at the door before I could even unpack our bags. Holmes, who anyhow tended not to participate in such mundane matters as unpacking, had just picked up his Stradivarius when our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, knocked at the door. "Yes," he called, and placed the violin back into its case before even having had a chance to play it. Mrs. Hudson entered with an unfamiliar East Asian man in European attire. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "excuse the interruption, but Mr. Shimada is here from the Japanese Embassy in London. He comes with an urgent request." Holmes immediately saw an opportunity for an exotic challenge, whilst I told myself that under no circumstances would I follow him to the Far East. He thanked Mrs. Hudson and asked her to leave so that we could have a private conversation with our guest. Once our housekeeper had shut the door, Mr. Shimada approached us and bowed. "Good day, gentlemen," he said in nearly accent-free English. "Konnichiwa," I heard Holmes answer to my surprise, and his Japanese greeting made my return bow appear a trifle clumsy. "What brings you here, Mr. Shimada?" "Sadly, a most regretful incident involving our head of delegation, the envoy to His Majesty the Tenno," Shimada replied. "It is truly a disturbing but also delicate matter. I was told that you, above all others, would handle this case with the sensitivity and discretion it requires." Holmes nodded. "Certainly," he assured. "Has the consul run into trouble?" Shimada took a deep breath. "You see, Mr. Holmes, the Japanese emperor is pursuing a policy of enlightenment and openness towards the world. The government has thus established provisionary diplomatic embassies in the most important European capitals, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, as well as here in London. Since the permanent status of these are yet to be determined, a bilateral upset or even scandal could result in a bitter setback to these efforts." "I understand," said Holmes, who, truth be told, showed little interest in politics or diplomacy. "What's the nature of this upset?" Shimada hesitated. "The consul is dead. He was murdered." Holmes's face could not hide his excitement, which is why, before Holmes even had an opportunity to speak, I took another bow and said, "Our sincerest condolences, Mr. Shimada." Holmes, somewhat caught off guard, nodded in agreement before jumping right into investigation mode. "How, where, and when did this occur?" "This morning," Shimada replied. "I rushed over here almost immediately. The consul explained of difficulties breathing, nausea, and numbness in his entire body that began at night and worsened over time. He soon stopped being able to breathe and suffocated to death in agony. There was nothing more we could do. "Did you call the police?" I interjected. Shimada said no. The Japanese embassy, including the living quarters which are located in the same building, are not publicly accessible and are more or less considered foreign territory. The British authorities can only get involved if we permit it. We decided that it would be more suitable to handle the matter internally in order to avoid any political upset, and most importantly, to keep it from the public. That's why we hoped you could resolve the case." "We shall certainly do so," declared Holmes. "I do have some more questions, though. Firstly, if the embassy is, as you claim, closed off to the outside, then the perpetrator must be one of the employees. Isn't that so?" "That is regrettably true," Shimada replied, "and another reason why I refrained from involving the British police." Holmes grew visibly more interested in the case. "And how many people work at the embassy?" he wanted to know. "5, Shimada answered before correcting himself. "I mean, 4, following the consul's death. The attache for economic affairs, the military attache, the cook, and myself." "Not many," Holmes mumbled to himself. "And what is your function, Mr. Shimada?" Shimada hesitated and lowered his head. "My official title is cultural attache. That, however, is just my cover. In reality, I'm a secret security officer, one of many that the Japanese Ministry of Internal Affairs assigns to each embassy. My duty is to protect our employees, especially the consul." The anguish Shimada felt about his personal failure was written on his face. It was difficult to find the right words. Holmes was quick to put that on display. "That is most regrettable," he said. "You evidently didn't fulfill your duties to the complete satisfaction of all." "A disgraceful shortfall on my part," Shimada confirmed, without showing whether his feelings were hurt by Holmes's remark. "Absolutely inexcusable. My only hope is that, with your much appreciated help, Mr. Holmes, we can at least solve the case, granting me mercy in the eyes of my superiors." "Do you have any knowledge of criminology?" Holmes inquired. "Not as much as you do," Shimada explained, displaying humility. "Although after my service for the Imperial Guard, I did work as a police detective in Tokyo." Before Holmes could make another thoughtless, insulting comment, I jumped in. "Your credentials will certainly benefit our cooperation. But Mr. Shimada," I continued, "as a physician I must ask, how can you be so sure that it was murder? Couldn't he have just as likely died from natural causes?" "You will certainly have an opportunity to verify my conclusion," Shimada answered. "But I recognize a poisoning of this kind when I see one. You must know that this is a common occurrence in Japan." I instinctively raised my eyebrows. "You mean murder by poisoning?" Shimada shook his head. "Not necessarily. I'm referring to death by fugu." This piqued Holmes's attention. "Fugu?" he repeated. "The Pacific blowfish," Shimada explained. "Its organs are extremely poisonous, and so is the skin of some species. Expert skill and knowledge are required to fillet and prepare the fish. That's why it's actually prohibited to eat fugu in Japan. Still, hundreds of people die from fugu poisoning each year, the majority on account of a lack of precaution or expertise, though some poisonings may be pretexts for actual murders. In our case, I have no doubt that fugu poison, which has to be extracted from the animal's gallbladder and carries a fishy odour, was the murder weapon. But the poison causes death only many hours after it's ingested, Holmes argued. That means the poisoning must have occurred last night. Did the consul leave the Japanese embassy at any time yesterday? Shimada shook his head. It now became clear to me that we knew both the scene and the time of the crime, and that only 4 potential suspects, including our client, were present in the building. After settling the financial terms, we said goodbye to Mr. Shimada and agreed to meet at the Japanese embassy in 1 hour. The Imperial Japanese Embassy was appropriately located on Piccadilly in Westminster. During the coach ride, Holmes mused over the fugu. An interesting animal, this blowfish, he said. It defends itself against being eaten with everything it's got. First, it scares off potential predators by inflating itself and showing off its spikes, and should it get caught, it kills the predator upon ingestion. I'll be sure to dedicate a few pages to it in my current manuscript. I looked at Holmes, perplexed. You're writing about old sea creatures? Don't be foolish, Watson, Holmes snapped back. I'm referring to my lexical survey of criminological toxicology. The volume is set to be published in a few months. A book about murder by poisoning, I corrected myself. Holmes disagreed, shaking his head vigorously. It's about analytical methods related to toxicologically induced, physiological and biochemical processes in the human body, and the diagnostics and verification thereof for the purpose of scientific criminology, he explained. About death by poisoning, I insisted, and quickly changed the subject. What we have here is a classic constellation. A closed-off space, a murder victim, and 4 suspects. I recently reread Poe's stories of Auguste Dupin. Dupin? Holmes interrupted. Spare me that Belgian dilettante. French, I corrected. Holmes furrowed his brows. Excuse me? He's actually from France. I cleared my throat. A French dilettante. Holmes waved me off. All the same, Watson, I don't see how these sorts of fictional adventure-filled investigations, replete with legends and speculative charlatanry, are in any way helpful. Or are you considering a Japanese macaque to be the culprit in the consul's case? Not exactly, I answered calmly, unless one is employed by the embassy. Holmes's facial expression fluctuated between punishing and surreptitiously amused as the coach came to a halt in front of the quite impressive, if not a trifle narrow, Japanese embassy. Mr. Shimada was already expecting us in front of the heavily secured iron gate. The windows were barred on all 3 floors. One thing was clear. It was in fact impossible for a perpetrator, neither human nor primate, to enter the embassy from outside. Mr. Shimada led us through the empty rooms of the embassy to the office of the deceased head of delegation on the 3rd floor. He instructed all employees to remain in their respective living quarters for the time being. The furnishings were modern and functional, though every object recalled the homeland, its culture, and history. A Japanese flag with a vermilion sun against a white background, an East Asian tea set, a game board with black and white pieces, screen paintings of artfully tended gardens, cherry blossoms, and geishas performing tea ceremonies, and an especially impressive antique samurai armor next to the door along two slightly curved swords on the wall. Holmes seemed to disregard the display pieces and walked straight to the couch on which the deceased body of the Japanese envoy lay. Was the body moved after his death? Holmes inquired. No, Shimada ensured. The consul died right here, in this position. Holmes waved at me to come examine the victim with him. Unlike that peaceful, almost sleeping expression that one often encounters on the deceased, the consul's body showed signs of death throes. His fingers were cramped like talons, his white head of hair was dishevelled. His skinny body, as a whole, looked a bit contorted. His pale skin had a bluish tint. His eyelids were opened unnaturally wide. I observed visible swelling and dark discoloration of his mouth, throat, and tongue. In fact, everything pointed to poisoning, and the fact that there were no puncture wounds suggested the poison was not given intravenously, but must have been ingested orally. Death by fugu, Shimada explained. It's an attack on the organs and the nervous system, and ultimately results in the paralysis of the respiratory system. Suffocation due to respiratory failure is the immediate cause of death. Not a very pleasant death, I attested. In Japan, Shimada explained, death by fugu is regarded as a senseless and thus dishonorable death, only when it's self-inflicted, that is. I presume, Holmes stated, that the blowfish is not on the menu here at the embassy. Shimada shook his head. Of course not. That would be illegal according to our laws. Just like murder, Holmes mumbled as he began pacing circles around the office. He stopped after the third round and looked at Shimada. We will now question your colleagues. Would you please bring them one at a time? Very well, Shimada replied. He headed toward the door, but turned around just before walking through it. Who would you like to start with? Holmes hesitated for a moment. With the cook, of course. A short time later, the chef stood before us. He was a small, visibly overweight, bearded man, clearly one of his best customers. It quickly became apparent that we could run into complications with our interrogation. The Japanese cook did not speak a word of English, prompting Mr. Shimada to interpret for us. Ask him, Holmes commanded, when he last prepared fugu. Shimada turned to the cook and translated. The smile that had been on the cook's face quickly faded, and he looked at us with a stern gaze. Keste, he cried intently. Before Shimada even had a chance to translate, Holmes piped up, I understand, and nodded at the cook reassuringly. Am I correct to assume that he has never prepared fugu, and would never do so, since that would challenge his moral integrity? More or less, Shimada answered. Gomen nasai, Holmes said to the cook before turning back to Shimada. We don't want to insult him, and in no way do we want to accuse him. Could he perhaps tell us what the last thing was the consul consumed last night? While Shimada was interpreting, I took Holmes aside for a brief moment. Holmes, where did you learn to speak Japanese? Not now, Watson, whispered Holmes, not taking his eyes off of Shimada and the cook. We are in the midst of a witness interrogation. Gentlemen, Shimada interrupted, we are ready. The consul, you must know, led an almost ascetic life. As usual, he didn't have any dinner yesterday, only requesting a cup of kukicha tea, which the cook prepared for him personally and served him here in his office. That was the last time he saw the consul. Afterwards, he cleaned the kitchen and went to bed. Holmes glanced at the desk, and there it was, a porcelain teacup. "This cup?" he asked, pointing at it with his right forefinger. The cook, who understood even without any knowledge of English, nodded fervently. Holmes walked to the table, picked up the cup, and examined it closely. There was nothing noticeably unusual about it, except for the artful Japanese manner with which it was manufactured. But then I watched Holmes move the cup towards his lips. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," I cried, and pulled back his arm. "Don't drink it." Holmes looked perplexed. My tugging caused the cup to slip from his fingers. It fell to the floor and broke into 2 pieces. "My dear Watson," he said calmly, "you've damaged evidence with your overzealousness. The cup was empty. I just wanted to smell it." As I was apologizing, ashamed of my actions, Holmes raised one of the shards with the handkerchief. He first held it under his own nose, and then directly under mine. "And?" he asked with anticipation. "You unquestionably have a good nose," I said without knowing where he was actually going with this. Holmes turned to Shimada. The slightly bitter and grassy smell of the green tea may have fooled the consul, but Dr. Watson and I certainly sense a subtle fish aroma. There was fugu poison in this cup. "Without a doubt," I confirmed, once again astounded by the breadth of Holmes's sharp acuity, for I had noticed nothing at all. Shimada nodded. "The gallbladder and the fugu emits an intense odor, and the poison extracted from it retains the smell. Good work, gentlemen. We have the murder weapon." I scratched my head as I looked at the shard in Holmes's hand whilst he was in the process of sending off the cook. "Arigato," he said, and implied a bow. "Mr. Shimada, if you would please bring us the next employee." The 2 embassy employees exited and left us to ourselves for several minutes. Holmes swung towards me as soon as the door shut. "Now, Watson, what do you think?" I had to think about it for a moment. I believed the cook would make the perfect suspect. He had knowledge, access, and opportunity, but I'm sure you'll explain to me why that is too simple of a supposition. Holmes nodded. The conditions to commit the crime are indeed perfect, perhaps too perfect. There's one thing you forgot, though. The cook had no apparent motive. I did not want to back down quite yet and added, the motive could have been any sort of triviality. A simple insult, perhaps. I heard that Asians tend to overreact to personal attacks. "My dear Watson," Holmes refuted, "I would never base our investigation on European prejudices. Moreover, a murder by fugu poisoning is hardly a crime of passion. No, our cook, a simple man and obedient servant, has certainly not travelled thousands of miles to London in order to murder the envoy of his heavenly sovereign. That makes no sense." Perhaps it was precisely the class distinction which caused the conflict that led to murder? I pondered, garnering a negative response from Holmes. "According to you," he said, "the murderer is always the gardener, the butler, or the cook. Most deadly crimes, however, apart from robbery, occur within one and the same social stratum." Mr. Shimada's return interrupted our little discussion. I was out of arguments anyhow. Next to him stood Mr. Katayama, the attache for Economic Affairs and Trade Relations. Mr. Katayama was an unusually tall, middle-aged man with a polite disposition similar to Mr. Shimada's. Restrained in his gestures and expressions, schooled in European etiquette, he was an experienced diplomat, well-versed in the English language. Naturally, this did not go unnoticed to Holmes. Mr. Katayama, he began his questioning. You've surely been in the diplomatic service of Your Majesty the Tenno for some time now. That is correct, answered Katayama. For many years I have been representing the Empire's economic and trade interests at various embassies. Most recently I was stationed in Prussia and southern Germany. I see, said Holmes. And what interests exactly do you represent? Well, as you probably know, Katayama explained, Japan had pursued an isolationist policy towards the West for over 200 years. Our ports were closed to European vessels except for those from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Since the final dissolution of the shogunate and the Meiji Restoration, we are now again seeking to connect with the latest international developments. We have been considerably behind in economic, scientific, and technical advancements. The industrialization of our country is in its infancy. We therefore strive to establish Japan as a modern industrialized nation that can participate in the foreign trade relations of Europe and the United States. To achieve this, however, we need knowledge and education, machinery and infrastructure, resources and raw materials, as well as a robust political system and a powerful military to get the job done. My time in the German Reich allowed me to gain valuable experiences and connections to this end. And we naturally hope to make similar progress here in the United Kingdom, Shimada added. Naturally, repeated Holmes, who is even less concerned with international trade relations than with international politics. And you, Mr. Katayama, what are your personal interests? Katayama seemed puzzled. I don't quite follow, Mr. Holmes. Pardon me, Holmes excused himself. Let me make myself more clear. I am curious whether you yourself own a business in Japan? I do, Katayama confirmed. My trading company is involved in international imports, particularly of metal wares and steel products. Naturally, we endeavor to establish our own steel industry. The interests of the Japanese Empire and mine are aligned in this regard. But what does this have to do with the murder of the consul? Holmes smiled. I just want to get a general picture, he assured. You're right. Let's focus on the case at hand. When did you last see the consul? This morning, Katayama answered. Mr. Shimada and I were trying to help him. We carried him to the couch, and that's where he died. Thank you, your colleague already told me about that, said Holmes. I am more interested in when you last saw the consul in good health. That would have been last night, the attaché explained. We briefly exchanged differing perspectives on trade contracts. An argument? Holmes asked. Not at all, Katayama asserted. Shimada chimed in. Excuse me, perhaps I may add something. Earlier, on his way back to his living quarters, the cook told me that he had overheard the consul raise his voice in his office while he was cleaning the kitchen, and that you, Mr. Katayama, were present during that time, engaged in a discussion. Mr. Katayama paused, then said, I don't always have to agree with the head of delegation. My duty as an expert also entails correcting potential miscalculations based on missing information. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And what was there to correct last night? Some contractual provisions, Katayama answered. Just details, nothing important. I was eventually able to persuade the consul. The conversation only lasted 5 minutes. Afterwards, I went straight to bed. I understand, said Holmes. Well now, that would be all, Mr. Shimada. Would you please bring me the military attache for questioning? Shimada nodded and left the office with Katayama. Once we were alone, I felt compelled to summarize the state of the investigation. What do you think, Holmes? The economic attaché wants to keep us in the dark regarding his argument. That's certainly true, Holmes answered. But don't forget, we are dealing with a murder. In a homicide investigation, even innocent people become hesitant to reveal any potential motives. I understand what you mean, I retorted, but I find Katayama's constant deflecting and placating somewhat suspicious. A smile escaped Holmes's lips. It seems to me, my dear Watson, that you found your new main suspect. Have you already cleared the cook? By no means, I cried. Good, remarked Holmes. It's important not to draw any premature conclusions, especially not before we have questioned all suspects and witnesses. And at that very moment, as if by stage direction, the door opened and in came Mr. Shimada. He was now followed by Mr. Hayashida, attaché for military affairs and armaments in the Japanese delegation. Mr. Hayashida was a white-haired, elderly army general in uniform, experienced in combat, patriotic, and traditional in values. I must mention that his English pronunciation and vocabulary was far from as proficient as Shimada's and Katayama's. For clarity, however, I have elected to only suggest his broken English in the following account. Holmes offered Hayashida the guest chair on our side of the desk, but he declined. I'd rather stand, he said, standing exceptionally straight. As you wish, said Holmes. Let's get straight to the point. When did you last speak with the consul? The general lowered his shoulders, almost as if by his own command, before answering. I came into the office when I heard all the commotion today. At that point, the envoy was already dead. We met here just last night to play a game. Holmes pointed at the board with the grid lines and pieces that stood on the desk. This game? Hayashida nodded. The game is called Go, he explained. The consul and I ended nearly every night with a game. I inspected the board and pieces. Seemed related to our drafts. The general turned to me and said, I don't believe a game as complex and philosophically profound exists in Europe. Before I could protest, Holmes resumed his line of questioning. How was yesterday's game? Did you win? Winning is of secondary importance in Go, Hayashida explained. What matters is discipline, concentration, and mental balance. And how did you fare in those respects? Holmes followed up. In fact, the consul found it difficult to concentrate yesterday, the general replied. He wished to abort the game after about 30 minutes, and then we both went to our respective rooms. Holmes nodded. That means you were the last person to see the consul yesterday, he determined. That seems to be the case, Hayashida confirmed. Holmes appeared to want to end the interview when I decided to bring up a different subject. General, I began, I myself served in the army of Her Majesty the Queen in India and Afghanistan. One thing would interest me. How does the Japanese Empire see its role in a time of heightened escalation between the great European powers and their military alliances? We will not interfere when the time comes for Great Britain, France, and Germany to fight over the distribution of their colonial loot like hyenas, Hayashida explained. I am not impressed by dishonorable warfare with gunboats, machine guns, and grenades, and whatever else will come in the future, in which a soldier has no value, and killing becomes an anonymous mass exercise. But I reckon the need to modernize the Japanese army accordingly, and to establish an independent defense industry. That's the only way to secure our own national and international interests, which include Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, as you know well. And we will shape our future alliances accordingly. This did not ease my concern and belief that in helping modernize, industrialize, and arm Japan, the Europeans and Americans were nourishing a serpent in Japan's bosom. But I kept that to myself. I do hope, I said, that our friendly relations with the Empire will culminate into a long-lasting, mutually beneficial partnership. The General nodded politely and did not show any signs of the doubts he most certainly harbored. Well now, said Holmes, who had seemed a trifle absent throughout our conversation, we don't want to bother Mr. Hayashida any longer. Thank you for your time. The General responded with a nod before turning around and heading towards the door. He paused briefly as he passed the samurai armor, taking a few seconds to examine it. Is that your armor? Holmes asked. No. Hayashida responded without turning. Not anymore. It was mine, but that was long ago. Very long ago. Shimada opened the door, and the General exited. Holmes crossed his arms, looked at the floor, and slowly paced in a circle. When I thought he would finally say something, he resumed pacing in the opposite direction. Shimada was not accustomed to Holmes's reflection ritual, so I cleared my throat to get Holmes's attention and succeeded. Ah, Mr. Shimada, Holmes cried, as if he had just noticed him at this very moment. You are precisely the man I need right now. At your service, Shimada said after a brief moment of bewilderment. How can I help you? We have now heard 3 of the 4 potential suspects, Holmes explained. The only one missing is you. Are you suspecting me? Shimada asked calmly. I would be a poor detective if I didn't, Holmes replied. You cannot deny that, from a purely technical standpoint, you would make the best candidate. It certainly would have been easy for you to commit the murder without leaving many usable traces. Shimada agreed. Naturally. Who else would be better suited to plan and execute the perfect murder than a former police investigator and detective? Holmes nodded contentedly. I can see we agree. Let's imagine the following. You just poisoned the consul, secretly spiked his tea with the extracts from the gallbladder of a fugu. Just a pinch. But there's still the rest of the poison, which you've presumably kept in a small bottle. This could incriminate you, so what do you do? Shimada had to think about it long and hard. I must hide the bottle, but not in my own room, for it would be found there sooner or later during the search. I don't have access to my colleagues' rooms, nor to the kitchen which the cork always locks. I must discard the bottle, right here, in the office. Quite right, said Holmes, and began to look around the room. A few seconds later, he turned to Shimada. All right, Mr. Shimada, would you be so kind as to call in the entire embassy staff? I will now solve the case. He could sense the relief on Shimada's face. Right away, Mr. Holmes, he answered, and set out. I was a bit surprised. Holmes, you've solved the case? I asked. Not yet, he replied, to my confusion. All we have are clues and suggestions, opportunities and motives, but no evidence. The cook had the most opportunity. The attache for economic affairs had an argument with the consul, and it would serve the general if the empire were to cut its diplomatic ties with Europe following an assassination. It would certainly have been possible for the latter to pour the poison into the consul's tea last night while he was momentarily distracted. Everything is possible, and let's not exclude the impossible. But Holmes, I said, still puzzled, you just promised to solve the case within the next several minutes. How? Elementary, Holmes insisted. If there's no evidence, then the culprit himself must produce the evidence. At that moment, I could not say I knew what Holmes was planning. I was certain, however, that he, as usual, knew exactly what he was doing. I thus collected myself and offered him my support. How can I assist you? Holmes smiled almost impishly. My dear Watson, just play along. Moments later, all employees of the Japanese embassy gathered in the office of the consul, whose body, now covered with a sheet, still lay on the couch, a silent witness to his own murder. The four suspects stood before us. The security officer, Shimada, the attaché for economic affairs, Katayama, General Hayashida, as well as the cook, whose name we still did not know, and for whom Shimada once again interpreted. Gentlemen, Holmes began, as if he were giving a toast at a party, thank you for coming. I called you here because I would like to solve the murder of your consul in your presence. That also means that one of you will be exposed and found guilty of the crime. Holmes let his words sink in as I scrutinized the four men. None of them seemed nervous or unsettled. The culprit, Holmes continued, did not make it easy for us. Proving murder by poisoning comes with many complications. The blowfish's poison was undoubtedly inside this, now unfortunately broken, teacup. Holmes pointed at the two shards on the desk. There is also no doubt that the consul ingested the poison last night by drinking his usual green tea, and that the poisoning caused his demise this morning. The perpetrator mixed the poison into the consul's tea at an opportune moment when he must have been briefly distracted. But what happened to the little bottle of poison? The culprit must have disposed of it as to avoid any connection to the murder. And he hid it here, in this very room. Holmes glanced around the office once more, then took 5 steps towards the samurai armor next to the door, where he waved at me to follow. Watson, would you please remove the helmet and turn it around? I did as I was told, and indeed, a small, unlabeled bottle was tucked between the fastening of the neck strap and the interior of the helmet. Holmes carefully removed it with a handkerchief, walked back to the desk, and set it down next to the broken teacup. He then turned back to the suspects, while I clumsily attempted to reattach the helmet correctly. This bottle of poison belongs to the culprit, Holmes explained to the attentive and utterly calm suspects. But whose is it? We now have a new way of determining its owner, using a novel process called dactyloscopy, also called the Gorton test, after its inventor. If you look at your fingertips, you will discover fine spiral ridges on your skin. These are the dermal papillae, and their pattern is different and unique to every person. Whenever someone touches an object, that person leaves behind a corresponding and directly attributable print, even if it's not detectable to the naked eye. The Gorton test makes these prints visible. We will therefore now retrieve the fingerprints from the bottle and then take your fingerprints to make a comparison. Holmes turned to me and said, "Dr. Watson, prepare everything to perform the Gorton test." I, of course, never heard of the Gorton test and had my doubts whether such a test even existed. "What? Now?" I asked with some trepidation. Holmes looked at me insistently. "When else, Watson? Go on now. You have everything you need for it in your doctor's bag." I opened my bag, which also stood on the desk, and looked inside. The first thing I grabbed was a bunch of scalpels. "My dear Watson," remarked Holmes, "I don't think it will be necessary to sever the fingertips of our subjects today." "Who knows?" I mumbled, and at last found some utensils that could be used to feign the procedure in question. I removed a bottle of distilled water, several small ampoules of drops against pain and fever, pipettes, a cotton ball, as well as a powder used to close wounds, and spread them out on the table. After an encouraging nod from Holmes, I announced, "Very well, we are ready for the Dalton test." "Gorton," Holmes hissed at me. "Precisely, the Gorton test," I corrected myself on the spot. Holmes smiled at the four suspects. "Who would like to begin?" "Not to worry, it doesn't hurt." The embassy employees scanned each other's hesitating faces. They clearly did not know what to think of this new test. The cook was the first to raise his hand, but was brusquely pushed aside from behind. Katayama jumped forward and headed towards the door. "This is ridiculous," he cried. "We won't let ourselves be subjected to this undignified test. General, intervene." But Hayashida remained composed. He looked at Holmes and then back at Katayama. "I will gladly undergo this test," he explained in a calm voice, "for my hands are as clear as my conscience." He raised both hands and showed his palms to underscore the metaphor. Katayama took another step backwards and bumped into the samurai armor. "Shimada, this is all your fault. Holmes doesn't have any authority here. Send him away." Shimada also remained unruffled. "If you'd prefer, Katayama, I could personally perform the Gorton test on you," he said. "Dr. Watson was so kind as to instruct the procedure to me." I nodded quickly to confirm that I had. "Give up, Katayama," ordered General Hayashida. "We assure you that you'll be extradited to Japan, where you'll have an opportunity to explain yourself before the Emperor's court." "Never!" cried Katayama. With a quick turn, he grabbed one of the samurai swords off the wall behind him, and instantly pulled it out of its sheath. Holmes was about to dash towards the perpetrator, but I restrained him by the shoulders. Just then, the cook blocked the door with his large body. "Get away from the door," Katayama yelled at him. "I don't want to hurt you, but I won't hesitate if I need to." He threatened the cook by waving the tip of the sword a few inches from his face, but the cook did not flinch and kept a straight expression. "Get out of the way, or else you'll be a dead man," Katayama warned in distress. In a fraction of a second, the cook struck the sword out of Katayama's hand with a blow to his arm, followed by a karate chop to his larynx, and threw him over his shoulder to the floor, pinning him down in a stranglehold. Katayama lay on the floor, unable to move and gasping for air. "You are hereby under arrest," Shimada declared. Together with the cook, they scooped up the murderer to take him to his room, in which he would remain locked up for the time being. That was the last time we saw Katayama. We sat silently on the ride home, for we needed to process the events that had occurred. Eventually, I could not keep my thoughts to myself any longer. "Holmes," I began, "what was all that about the Gorton test? That could have gone wrong. I've never heard of it before." Holmes winked at me and replied in confidence. "The Gorton test does not exist. I mean, to be precise, it does not yet exist. But it is true that Francis Gorton, a colleague of yours, is presently developing a procedure that can determine the identities of individuals using fingerprints. It will still take years, perhaps even decades, until this becomes a reliable criminological method that can hold up in court. That means," I added, "that future investigations will be significantly easier, at least as long as the criminal doesn't wear gloves." "Not to worry, my dear Watson," Holmes answered. "You can be certain that a detective's most valuable tool will continue to be the mind." The next morning, at the breakfast table on Baker Street, I wanted to understand the last mystery surrounding the case of the murdered Japanese envoy. While Holmes unsuspectingly drank his tea, I assailed him with my request. "Holmes, you still owe me 2 explanations." "I do?" he asked. "What's still on your mind?" "Firstly," I began, "I would be interested in knowing how you knew the location of the hidden bottle of poison. If you hadn't found it, your little show would have failed." "Well, that was quite simple," Holmes claimed. "The chin strap of the samurai helmet had been shifted and appeared unsymmetrical. No one would do that to a display piece. Someone must have recently handled it hurriedly. It was the first thing I noticed when we entered the consul's office." "Holmes, you are a remarkable and at once curious person," I said in amazement. "And that brings me to my second question." "Go on," Holmes said with a welcoming motion of the hand. I looked at him with a serious expression. "Your Japanese skills. Holmes, where did you acquire those?" "That's an old story," Holmes said dismissively. 10 years ago, I travelled to Vienna for the World's Fair. It was the first time the Japanese Empire took part in a World's Fair. and they did so with a large delegation. A chance acquaintance showed me the art of origami. That's where I must have picked up some Japanese words. I was not sure whether to believe his story. Origami? An acquaintance? I repeated suspiciously. Yes, my dear Watson, Holmes confirmed gaily. A young lady. I believe I still remember her name. Naruko Yanagihara. For goodness sake, Holmes, I cried and smacked myself on the forehead. Your memory is remarkable. But don't you know who this Naruko of yours is? Today she's the mother of the heir to the Japanese throne. Holmes was visibly surprised. Is that so? Before I had a chance to explain to Holmes the complexities of the relations that exist at the Japanese court, Mrs. Hudson knocked at the door. She surprised us with a small package and letter that the courier had delivered. Holmes opened the letter. It was from Shimada. Katayama confessed, Holmes reported, after having read the letter. Shimada writes that Katayama confessed to accepting bribes from the Prussian steel industry for favorable trade contracts. The consul found out about his machinations, threatened to report him, and was therefore murdered by Katayama. What a profane, trivial motive. Money, I determined. Yes, our fee has been deposited in my bank account, Holmes added. Shimada excuses himself for not having come by personally. This morning, he is already in transit to board a ship to Yokohama, where he will personally hand Katayama over to the Japanese authorities. And what's in the package? I asked, as I began to open it. A Japanese delicacy. With best regards from the head cook, Holmes explained. The package contained small bites, reminiscent of hors d'oeuvres, but topped with fish. The white blobs underneath the fish appeared to be made of rice. Go on, try it, Watson, Holmes dared. According to the letter, it's tuna, not fugu. That's comforting, I replied, as I bravely picked up one of the pieces and slid it into my mouth. Despite of its peculiar and indistinct consistency, an interesting taste unfolded. Below the dominant flavor of fish, there was a sour note, presumably due to the preparation of the rice. Not too bad, I concluded. What is this dish called? Holmes took another look at the letter. It's called sushi. A name as simple as the concept, I said, and picked up another piece. Well, I've been convinced. Holmes, however, shook his head. I'm not so sure, Watson, he said, thinking out loud. Raw fish on sticky rice balls? That will never catch on in Europe. Then, seemingly lost in thought, he slowly began folding the letter into the shape of a dove. The end. This has been Sherlock Holmes and the Japanese Envoy, The New Adventures, Episode 3, by William K. Stewart and F. E. Patzak. Spoken by Sam Kusi.